on the 25th of May, Africans worldwide celebrate Africa Day, a day on which they commemorate the founding of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, which in July 1999 changed name to what we have today as the African Union, or AU. 45 years ago, leaders of 30 of the 32 independent African states signed a founding charter at Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and one of the aims was to get Africa united economically and socially. Economists, and indeed social gurus, claim the 21st century belongs to Africa and that Africa is becoming a superpower. For many years, Africa has been treated as a project, not a continent, and many believe it is time to rebrand Africa with African qualities. Here in Britain this year, for the first time, an event organized by the Cambridge African Students' Union was held to commemorate Africa Day, themed Africa Together. Here is what transpired. Music full of soul. That was all part of the program to remind these young Africans in the diaspora about the continent they left behind when they came here. The dialogue began with discussions of fashion and music and how these can be used to better portray the continent, but with no set body to promote, create, or fund the arts in many parts of the continent, and with negative connotations associated to the industry by the older generations. This too remains elusive and a huge challenge. Designers in attendance were unhappy that many Africans are not consumers of African fashion. Keynote speaker Sir David King talked about the challenges of the 21st century, citing food production, conflict and terrorism, energy, security and supply, climate change, health and development, ecosystems and minerals as the main issues.
I believe this is the century of Africa. We're already seeing many of the signs of the African shoots that are really changing Africa. 8 out of 20 of the fastest growing economies in the world of the last 4 years are in Africa. And so this isn't just a pipe dream. This is the awakening of a continent. It's been a painful process, and we've heard about that. The new Africa is emerging now. And I want to say, however, that this new Africa that emerges should not be an imitation of the old, tired economies.
And Lord Hastings agreed with him.
The Africa that is arising is technologically smart, that is well connected, that is media savvy, that is intelligent, high numbers of young men and women passing through university seeking progressive careers in real industries.
However, economically, Africa continues to be the big loser.
The world receives every year $6 billion worth of African coffee from roughly 12 of the 54 countries on the continent. That coffee is mainly processed in Europe, repackaged, branded, and sold outside, some back to the continent, total value $100 billion. So here's the equation. Africa gets 6 billion, and the rest of the world gets 94 billion on the back of our asset. That is not good economics.
With matters economics dealt with, the focus then turned to the media, how effective they are, and if they are portraying Africa as the continent needs to be portrayed.
For me, the biggest issue really isn't so much, what does the Economist have to say about Africa? What does the FT have to say about Africa? So often we're fixated on these foreign names, and it tends to be Western names. We need to reclaim the narrative on the media space in the same way that the Arab states have done with Al Jazeera. And there's lots of problems with Al Jazeera, and there's lots of criticisms to be made about it. But it is no longer possible for any other media in the world to write the narrative on what's happening in the Middle East, because it will be challenged. The biggest problem we have in Africa is that there is no institution, media institution, big enough, strong enough, and credible enough to offer the counter-narrative consistently. What the new ecosystem looks like exactly is very difficult to predict. It's almost impossible to predict, largely because my inclination is that the people who are going to be the quote-unquote media barons of the 21st century aren't even thinking about media right now. a lot of things are going to be reconstituted fundamentally. I can't stress that enough. And I think even within media, people have no idea. We talk about disruption. That's the understatement of the century.
The question of media freedom could not be avoided, since Africa is known to have some very oppressive regimes.
That, media has a critical role to play in our societies. And on the African continent, where we are now, that's the kind of media we need. A media which creates, empowers. The reality is this. Despite all its problems, the media landscape in Kenya is far better than in many other countries. And this can be very much discussed and debated, but it is the reality. I look at the media in the 54 African nations, and I can tell you that you do not necessarily want to be in some other category. And I believe that in Kenya, it can improve. And it will improve, because you know what? At the end of the day, who is the judge? It's you, it's the audience. And when the audience sees that media houses, established media houses, are not doing their work, in other words, they're not making progress and empowering people, what happens is that they will go to some other sources. And those sources are everybody else. That's citizen journalists, that's bloggers, and others and others. So at the end of the day, the media, you have a big power of sanction on the media, and you have to exercise it. Because if you just consume what the media houses give you, and you don't actually sanction them negatively, they'll just keep doing that.
The dialogue has begun, but are the leaders listening? The agreement was, rebranding Africa will take more than just rhetoric. It has to be the responsibility of every African to take back the narrative and tell the real stories. Known as the Dark Continent for too long, Brigitte Sesu from Nigeria talked about the need to rebrand Africa so that the people can see value in themselves.
The history of Africa started in slavery. Africans were essentially non-entities that were slaves and that were enslaved for about 400 years, and that slowly bled into colonialism. The history of the continent is not really generally known before this time. I think that's very damaging. It's damaging to the self-esteem of the Africans who believe that they've come from nowhere, and to the rest of the world who, based on this lack of context, have formulated stories of identity for Africans around this.
For a long time, the world has portrayed Africa as tragic, a place to be pitied, helped, and taught. But a mindset change is needed if expectations are to be met. One thing everyone agreed about is the fact that Africa is not just about malaria, starvation, and AIDS, nor is it defined by the wars in pockets of the continent. Africa Day was initiated as a platform to acknowledge and celebrate Africa's history, heritage, and culture.
Yeah,
For many years, Africans have blamed slavery and colonialism for all their troubles. However, as we enter fully into the 21st century, many are in agreement. This is the watershed moment for Africa. It is time to change the song, to write Africa's plenty alongside her poverty. The situation, though hardly ideal, has improved, and waiting for the West to legitimize something, be it music, fashion, or the arts, is no longer the ideal.